Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Gwei Refuel, where I recap the latest news in the Ethereum ecosystem. I'm your host, Anthony Sassano, and today's the 22nd of August, 2022. Alright everyone, let's get into it. So we have some merge related news today. The clients are starting to come out for the merge. So if you're running, I guess like most of the clients I think are out right now, or at least they're kind of like been rolling out during the day. There is a new Geth client out, which is merge ready, or mainnet merge ready. I saw Lighthouse release one, and Teku, I believe the others have either been released or are in the process of being released. So obviously post merge you'll need to run your own execution layer clients such as Geth or Nethermind, and your own consensus layer clients such as Prism or Lighthouse, or any of the other ones out there. They all work. So definitely go upgrade your nodes if you are running a solo staking setup, and if you're kind of like staking with a provider such as a centralized exchange or a staking service provider, or even something like a Rocket Pool, they'll kind of like handle that on the on that side for you if you've just kind of delegated your stake there. But if you are kind of like running your own, I guess, like staking setup, your own solo validator, DAppNode is some software that you may have come across in your travels. It is basically a very nice streamlined graphical user interface, or GUI, for you to manage all of your node infrastructure. And now they announced multi-client support on DAppNode, which is now live. So you can install the new kind of core of DAppNode software, install new Prism, and you can now find your keys to the Web3 signer and change CL clients with one click. So you can change from Prism to Lighthouse to Teku to Lodestar to anything else, any of the clients there with one click, which is awesome. I think, you can see the GIF here of how easy it is to change. There's basically a configuration menu here and a drop down where you can select between the major clients, which is just absolutely awesome to see there. So great to see DAppNode releasing this year. Obviously, client diversity is critically important to the health of both the execution and consensus layers. Consensus layer client diversity is looking very healthy, as I went through last week. Execution layer, we're going to work on post-merge. I think everyone wants to see the merge go through smoothly with what we've got currently in terms of the share of the network. And I mean, basically, we're at the point where if Geth works fine, then most of the network is going to be fine. But definitely post-merge, we want to work on execution layer client diversity as well. So if you're running DAppNode, install the new update here, and you'll be able to have access to all of these new features. All right, so Brian Armstrong from Coinbase shared this interesting little chart here today that I wanted to kind of go over with all of you. But this is basically the G20 plus crypto regulatory tracker. So it's got a list of countries here, and basically 6 different columns where basically they're labeled crypto framework, tax, AML, CFT/CFT, travel rule, stablecoin regulations, and CBDCs, and basically the status of each of these depending on the country. So let's go through the countries that get brought up the most. The United States. The United States down the bottom doesn't have a crypto framework, and there's been no regulatory process that has been initiated here. There is regulation in place for tax, of course, for AML and CFT, for a travel rule, nothing in place and nothing kind of like being worked on for stablecoin regulation, but there is regulation underway for CBDCs. Then you look at the other side of the spectrum, which is China, where the crypto framework, they've just basically prohibited all crypto. Tax, it's because it's prohibited, there's no tax revenue. AML, not needed because it's prohibited. Travel rule, not needed because it's prohibited. And stablecoin regulation, again, it's prohibited. But CBDCs, they have regulation in place. So obviously China is taking the approach of a fully controlled and regulated CBDC, where the CCP has complete, I guess, overview of absolutely everything happening in, I wouldn't even call CBDC crypto, but they want to see everything happening on the digital currency space. Whereas, the United States obviously is on the other end of the spectrum there. And you can see the other countries here and where they kind of fall. But I think, as Brian says, this is something that's not been widely reported on, but each country around the world, or at least kind of like the G20 plus countries, are definitely looking at this. And I mean, here I am in Australia at home here. Apparently we have regulation underway for a crypto framework. Tax and AML is in place. There's no travel rule. There's pending stablecoin regulation and pending CBDC regulation. But I did see today that some news came out that Australia wants to kind of like put a framework around tokens. I don't know what that's going to look like. I have a feeling it's going to follow very closely with the existing regulations that exist in the US and maybe even other parts of the world like the UK, Canada. I don't know if New Zealand has anything, but generally, much of the Western world, or I guess like what is regarded as the Western world, Western democracies, follow similar regulations. So we'll have to see how that kind of shakes out. But yeah, I think people often may get this kind of like idea that these countries aren't looking at crypto in any real big way. I mean, there's obviously a lot of work to be done, and it's funny how like the two most filled out columns here are tax and AML, because those are what has basically been front of mind, right? Like tax, obviously the governments want to collect as much tax as possible. And obviously they want, they need to be able to give the clarity there so people can actually file their tax return, file it accurately. And AML, which is anti-money laundering, or just, I guess, like regulations around money laundering in general, are top of mind for them too, as we've seen over the last few weeks especially. And then there's like travel rules and things like that, which are less filled out. So yeah, just wanted to put this on your radar. You can go check out this chart. I'll link it in the YouTube description below. But yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, whether we want it or not, regulations are coming. It's just all about getting I wouldn't say good regulations, but maybe like the least worst, so we don't end up with like the China end of the spectrum, because it is a spectrum at the end of the day. I'd rather be, much more on the spectrum of maybe how the US is approaching it, even though the US's regulations aren't good either. Like, as I said, it's a least worst system, not a good system, but we don't want to end up like China, where they just basically outright ban everything and only have CBDCs, which are complete surveillance, complete control. That's where, we don't obviously want to be heading into. So yeah, it's great to see that most countries aren't heading in that direction, at least not now. All right, so back on the Tornado Cash news. So here's a thread posted on Twitter about the little protest that happened in Amsterdam here. So there was a protest in Amsterdam for the arrested Tornado Cash dev Alex Pertsev here, which I guess like is an unfortunate thing that there has to be a protest for this. But as far as I know, he's still under arrest. I don't know if he's been charged formally with anything yet, which is really weird considering how long he's been under arrest for. But yeah, there was I guess like a decent showing here of people, considering that this is obviously one city in the world, and obviously happened very quickly. But you can see the thread here of the people that attended, and it's just great to see that people are protesting this, I guess, publicly. Now, depending on your view on protests in general, whether they do anything or not, like that's a whole nother kind of like, I guess, a whole nother topic of discussion that I'm not going to get into, but I just wanted to put this thread on your radar to know that there is people out there fighting in any way that they can and kind of protesting in any way that they can for, I guess, justice here when it comes to Tornado Cash, and especially when it comes to Alex, who is, I believe, the only Tornado Cash dev that has been arrested so far. But, I mean, hopefully he will be the last. Hopefully he'll be freed. But, I'm not holding my breath there. I feel like there's possibly more arrests to come. But, yeah, just wanted to highlight that for you guys. There is, I guess, probably a bunch more to get through with regards to the Tornado Cash stuff. But I did cut it down because I know I've talked about it a lot on the refuel, and I explained last week how I think it's really important. But I don't want every refuel from now on to just become talking about this, because I think most of us up to speed with everything at this point, and understand where everyone kind of like sits. But there are some new developments that happened over the weekend that I want to talk about, especially new threads. So this one comes from Alex Vandersand, who is an OG in Ethereum. He's been in Ethereum since 2014, so he has been around the block, so to speak. So he put out a tweet thread where he said, "There's no OFAC fork, social consensus slashing, or UASF needed. We've gone through this on the DAO wars already. If too many validators refuse to add a transaction, they can be DDoSed. If they refuse a valid block, then they're the ones forking and risk slashing. How to DDoS a censoring validator. Flood the network with very complex transactions that, by the end of them, touch Tornado Cash. Because of the halting problem, the validator can't know what they do, what the transactions do, without executing them fully, so they're forced to do unpaid computational work. Of course, if there are enough non-censoring validators, the attacker has to pay for some of the submitted transactions, so it needs a threshold to work. But if there are enough non-censoring validators, then we've got what we want. It just takes a bit longer. But isn't there a risk that some institutions would want to create what would basically be a POA network ran only by US compliant entities? Yes, those are the bank chains being developed. Tons of those will exist. I just wouldn't call them Ethereum." So this is another kind of like technical, I guess you could call it, solution to this problem of censoring validators here. But I am not sure how workable this is. As Alex said, that there is an economic cost here of submitting these transactions, and I'm not sure like how much of an impact it would have. I think that this is just one solution of many, but I just wanted to put it on your radar that this does exist. But at the end of the day, like, the motivation for doing this probably isn't there, because even if like 90% of the validators on the network are censoring your transactions, say they're Tornado Cash transactions, there is still 10% that aren't. So your transaction is going to get into a block eventually anyway. And this is what I think a lot of people don't realize, is there's two kind of like main things at play here. There is censorship in the kind of validators not including your transactions in blocks, but still mining blocks or proposing blocks on and attesting to blocks on the canonical chain post-merge. So that's one form of it. That form is less of a concern, or I guess like much less of a concern than the other form, which is validators refusing to build on top of a chain that contains censored transactions or contains sanctioned, I guess, like transactions in blocks. That would result in a fork, and there would basically be two chains. There would be kind of like the OFAC chain, and then there would be the canonical chain. Now, where social slashing would come in, or I guess like the real Ethereum chain rather than the canonical chain, where social slashing would come in would be the community coming together and saying, well, these people basically want to mine on their OFAC chain. We don't want them in the real Ethereum, so we're going to slash them on the real Ethereum. They're probably going to end up getting slashed anyway from not mining on the main chain or suffer inactivity leaks. But, we're going to take away their stake because they no longer represent the, I guess, will of the community. Whereas I don't think social slashing would be used in the scenario of, a lot of block producers or a lot of validators not including censored transactions, because, and Polynya put an opinion out about this, where they said, they've refrained from commenting on the topic because of an unpopular opinion. Actually, sorry, I should give some context here. So Polynya is quote tweeting Taken's theorem, who basically highlights that Ethermine, which is the largest Ethereum miner, has stopped including Tornado router transactions over a week ago. So they've stopped including those transactions at all. And this is on proof of work. This isn't even talking about proof of stake here. But then Polynya quote tweets this and said, they think this is an unpopular opinion, but they said Ethermine or any block producer has the right to include transactions as they please. As a community, we should open a dialogue, help them, and attempt to resolve such issues using diplomatic and legal means. And then Polynya continues, it is perfectly reasonable for a block producer to comply with their jurisdiction's regulations. As a community, we shouldn't use fear of slashing or social vilification, pressuring them to exist, etc. Rather, help them fight these regulations if they are unjust. And then they go on with a bunch of other things, and you can read this thread. I'll link in the YouTube description. But I want to say that, like, after thinking about this a lot more, I actually agree with Polynya here. Obviously, I don't want to see any censorship on the network, but at the end of the day, whether it be miners, validators / block producers, or anyone producing a block, has always had the ability to include whatever transactions they want in a block. Normally, the transactions get included by fee priority, right? If the people paying the larger fees get included first. That's how the fee market works on Ethereum. But if the block producers don't want to include a transaction, well, that's totally on them. Yes, it is a form of censorship, but it is different to what I described before around building on the non-canonical chain and basically forking off into your own chain. So from that perspective, I agree with Polynya here. Though I would say that even though I agree with them on this, it's also a very bad kind of, I guess, social signal if like 90% of the network is censoring transactions or not willing to include transactions in their blocks. Yes, your transaction will be eventually included in a block, so it's not a critical, issue where essentially you're completely barred from using the network altogether or interacting with certain contracts altogether. But it is a really big kind of like issue in that the Ethereum's credible neutrality takes a hit and Ethereum censorship resistance takes a hit. Even though you can still get your transactions in, from a pure social perspective, it takes a hit, right? The credibility takes a hit there. So as Polynya said, we should work with these entities in order to fight bad regulations, enable them to be able to include transactions in blocks without even knowing what's in them. So for example, having base layer privacy or having things like a shutterized beacon chain where you don't know what the transactions are until they're actually mined, which would be a really nice stopgap solution. between kind of like having full base layer privacy and no privacy at all for transactions. So using those kind of things to help them would be better than, I guess, like constantly threatening them with social slashing. Now, I want to clarify my point here. I am very much in favor of social slashing as still a last resort, but as something that to be used if block producers are building on top of a non-canonical chain and are just refusing to build on top of that chain. I'm not necessarily in favor of using it for block producers that are just censoring transactions or not including transactions in their blocks, but those transactions are eventually included anyway. And it gets very murky when you go down that path because, as I said, there is a strong social signal that gets sent if a lot of the network is censoring, and it kind of like waters down Ethereum's credible neutrality. But at the end of the day, that should be solved on the technical layer rather than the social layer with those kind of like privacy things that I've been talking about. But if there is kind of like an attack on the network where the chain is splitting because of that censorship, because the validators are not attesting to or proposing blocks that contain these transactions at all, it's more attesting kind of post-merge while they're, or not, you know, building on the I guess like right head of the chain, right, the canonical head of the chain, then I am definitely in favor of using that nuclear option. And I think it should be used if there is no other way to kind of like get around this or other way to kind of rectify this issue. But I am definitely more in favor of the technical solutions before we start using any social solutions. But the credible threat that social slashing exists needs to be put out there. We need to kind of signal that we are willing to do this. And at the end of the day, when push comes to shove and we actually need to use it, we better be ready to use it. Like, there shouldn't be a strong social signal put out there and then we don't actually use it. Now, hopefully, it never comes to that point. But we're not here to hope for things. We're here to plan for worst case scenarios, and that is what will happen in the worst case scenario. But I'm going to keep promoting the technical solutions such as PBS and CR lists and shutterized beacon chain and privacy at the base layer in general, because that way the block producers have, I guess, like plausible deniability that they don't know what transactions they're mining. So how can they possibly adhere to any kind of like sanctions, for example? How can they possibly censor anything if they don't know what the transactions are until they've been proposed? Now, that doesn't obviously stop people from refusing to attest to a chain that contains censored transactions or contains like sanctioned transactions, but that's different to, I guess, not including things in blocks because they've been sanctioned and stuff like that, right? So hopefully that clears up some of the, I guess, nuances around that. There's also a really excellent post here from, I gotta get this tab, it's gone, it's lost on me, from BitMEX here, where they talk about how there are a lot of technical nuances when it comes to Ethereum proof of stake and censorship. And this blog post is linked at the bottom here. I highly recommend giving this a read because I actually learned a lot from this. And BitMEX Research is one of the best research blogs out there. But basically, there are 7 different scenarios here that could happen in the OFAC situation on a proof of stake Ethereum. And there's the 7 listed here. Actually, technically 8 here, but like the 7th is just ignoring the OFAC rules altogether, which I guess isn't exclusive to Ethereum proof of stake. So technically, there's 7. But I'm not going to go through them all. I want you to read this blog post because it's very important to understand the technical nuances of Ethereum proof of stake and how it's fundamentally different to a proof of work network on the technical side, especially Ethereum proof of work. In saying that, the similarities and why I've been saying that proof of work or proof of stake doesn't matter is in the fact that censorship can happen on both in very similar ways. And those 2 main ways of not including transactions in blocks at all and then refusing to build on a chain that has sanctioned transactions as part of the chain, right? So those are still the same, whether it's proof of work, proof of stake, DPoS, POA, it doesn't matter, right? What matters is the technical nuances when you get into the weeds of how the protocol actually handles this on a technical level. And that's exactly what BitMEX's blog post goes through. So I highly recommend checking that out. I'll link it in the YouTube description below. Just a couple more things to get through here. Banteg has been putting together a really nice little, I guess, graphic here showing the individual validators. I think I talked about this last week about which ones have committed to not censor and which ones haven't said anything yet. But they've also broken down the individual Lido validators by stake. So everyone always says, oh, well, Lido has over 30% of the stake. Yes, they do, right? yes, there is potential centralization vectors there, but Lido is not a monolithic organization. It is an organization made up of 29 different operators here, as you can see listed out in this graphic. And each of those operators has a different percentage of stake allocated to them, but none of them have a kind of like a 30% at all, like not even close to that. So I think right now Lido governance can't actually kick out any validators. I think it would be up like Lido, the Lido DAO. I'm not 100% across like what the powers are right now. Lido is certainly not decentralized at this point in time, but I think it's very important whenever someone brings up Lido as this monolithic entity to tell them, well, no, it's not. I mean, there is the STETH token, which I guess like it does introduce centralization into the mix, because obviously these staking providers are at the mercy of that STETH, because the STETH has a claim on the ETH in their services. But the services themselves are all part of different providers. They're not all based in the US, right? They're globally distributed here. They have different teams behind them, and some of them are just pure staking providers. Some of them are teams that do multiple things. Like for example, you have here Prism, right? Prismatic Labs. They build an ETH2 client, right? They're building the Prism client, but they're also a validator as part of Lido here. So there is just kind of like a very diverse set of validators, a very diverse set of staking providers, and this list is going to grow over time. So yeah, I have a pet peeve about people saying that Lido is this monolithic entity, but in saying that, we obviously don't want Lido's dominance to be as high as it is in general, like just for the kind of like reasons I outlined with the STETH token especially. And I've said before how I believe that once withdrawals are enabled, we'll see this great reshuffling of stake, and also as more competition comes online and improves, there's going to be people staking with that instead of Lido there. So yeah, I just wanted to highlight that little graphic there for you in the, I guess, like same topic of the kind of like sanctions and validator centralization and everything like that. And Victor Bunin put out a really great kind of tweet here. I was quote tweeting something that Matt Huang put out from Paradigm. But basically, he said, gentle reminder that without privacy, all that we're building is the most perfect version of warrantless financial surveillance technology. And he's hit the nail on the head here. Both Bitcoin and Ethereum, like the vanilla networks themselves, have absolutely no privacy. They are so bad at privacy that if you send funds from one of your addresses to another one and you only do one transaction, those addresses are forever linked. There's no way to unlink them. So that's how bad the privacy is. And that's just kind of like one simple example. So because of that, if we don't develop privacy solutions, if we don't improve privacy on Ethereum, then we are creating, as Victor says here, the perfect version of warrantless financial surveillance technology, which is dystopian as hell. Like, that is the worst outcome of this technology. And that's why I've said time and time again, privacy is both a right, and privacy is and should be one of the top priorities right next to scaling for the Ethereum ecosystem, because without privacy, none of this shit means anything. Like, Ethereum does not give people more freedom and give people kind of like more sovereignty if there's no privacy. I'm not talking about the fact that we have to have base layer privacy. I'm talking about everything that can add more privacy to Ethereum should be worked on, should be kind of put out there. I know we've kind of like taken a back seat here because of the OFAC sanctions and everyone's kind of like in limbo right now, but that shouldn't take away from the fact that we need to keep building privacy solutions. And we need to fight for them. We need to fight the regulations in the real world to ensure that we can keep building privacy solutions. Because at the end of the day, as I've said before, privacy to me is a human right. We all have a right to privacy, and we shouldn't lose our right to that. And we shouldn't be able to not use the tools such as Tornado Cash just because criminals use it. Because at the end of the day, criminals use end-to-end encrypted messaging too. But that's not banned. They tried to ban it at one point, and governments around the world, some of them have banned it. But at the end of the day, the US hasn't, right? Maybe I hope they don't ever ban it, but they haven't right now. And people use it, and it's very easily accessible. So the same should be true for our financial activity on networks like Ethereum. We should be able to get full privacy of our transactions. Now, that's the optimistic thing. That's kind of like me saying that we should be able to get these things, but there is unfortunately something that happened over the weekend that with Aztec network that saddened me. So Aztec, I believe the most of the Aztec team, or at least the founders, definitely are based in the UK. They're not based in the US, but because the UK is part of that Five Eyes organization that I talked about last week, the Aztec protocol is still at the mercy of something like the Tornado Cash sanctions or something like the US. Now, they put out this thread where they said, "We are aware of reports that FTX is warning users not to interact with Aztec. As a result, we want to underscore our current and ongoing risk reduction framework to implement practical deterrents and measure their effectiveness." And then they go on to the thread about what they're doing here. Now, the most concerning thing to me here, and I don't necessarily blame Aztec for this, I blame obviously the poor regulations for this, but the most concerning thing to me is this tweet here. So where is the tweet? Where where is the tweet? I think it's this one. So this is what they're going to be implementing on the Aztec networks: system-wide daily asset deposit caps, IP-specific deposit rate limiting, single address pending deposit caps, and constraints on the escape hatch window, activating only in case of a liveness failure. The reason why I find this to be really bad is because all this does is punish the regular user. Every single person that wants to use privacy tools as a criminal to do money laundering, to evade sanctions, is going to get around each of these relatively easily, especially on a network like that is actually decentralized like Ethereum. And that's why I said the Tornado Cash sanctions don't make much sense, because North Korea or whoever wasn't using the front end, right? Anyone who wanted to launder money, anyone who wanted to kind of like evade sanctions was not using the front end. They were using the immutable smart contracts on Ethereum that still exists today. Tornado Cash is still in operation. That wasn't taken down. So all that happened is that they've punished regular users. And then they've also introduced this chilling effect where everyone is so scared now to build, support privacy solutions. They're so scared that they're going above and beyond what's required of the sanctions and blocking people who are even just kind of like 1 degree of separation away from these addresses, from the Tornado Cash addresses, and it's led to that big chilling effect there. And the chilling effect has now hit Aztec, which is really, really sad because I love Aztec. I mean, disclosure, I'm an investor in Aztec, but I mean, I'm not surprised by this. I'm just extremely disappointed that it's come to this. I understand why they have to do it. But at the end of the day, like, we really do need to keep building these solutions. We need to build them as anons. We need to build them in a decentralized way. And I know it's really easy for me, someone who is both not a US citizen and is not building any of these solutions, to say this. But I mean, I guess like I'm in that position to be able to say it. Like, I know a lot of these teams can't say it because they're building it. They don't want to be doing this. They don't want to be putting in these restrictions. Most of them, if not all of them, are building these solutions to kind of give people privacy and give them something that they believe is a right, but they're being forced. Their hands are being forced here. They are not anonymous people. They are based in jurisdictions that have extradition treaties with the US. They're not going to just, ignore the sanctions. They're not going to be, willy-nilly about this. They're going to be very conservative, especially if they have lawyers breathing down their necks saying, hey, if you don't do this, there is a risk that you're going to jail for 30 years. Like, I think people are being very harsh on these people that have to comply. I think what should be happening is that instead of going after these people that are complying with these sorts of things and then going above and beyond as well, which I think is stupid, but it happens, we should be fighting the regulations themselves. So anyway, I'm going to leave that at that. You can go read this whole Aztec thread for a breakdown of this year, but I just thought it was quite sad and disappointing that, and not surprising that Aztec has to go down this path now, but that's the reality of the situation right now. And finally, on the, censorship-resistant front, we have Mallows here with a thread about there's a chart here that shows the current state of Ethereum, dApps, and DeFi, and areas where we excel and others where points of failure exist, which I think is a really, really good chart because you can see here what is censorable, what is unknown, trusted, and mutable experiences, and what is censorship resistant and provably trusted. And this basically takes my layered approach to what is kind of like censorable and what is not, and I guess like maps it out here. So you can see on the far right side, there is censorship resistant and provably trusted things, such as the Uniswap smart contract is immutable, can't be tampered with, can't be changed even by governance, right? Whereas on the other side, on the left side, you have censorable, such as the Uniswap front end or the Aave front end or a generic kind of front end. Very, very censorable. Shouldn't expect any censorship resistance from that at all. And then you have all these other entities here. I'll link this in the YouTube description for you to check out. I'm not going to go over all of it here, but there's also a thread that accompanies it as well, and it breaks it all down. So I highly recommend giving the thread a read. I will link it there for you. And just going to get through the rest of these because I'm going over time here. So I've been seeing a lot of people talk about Ethereum layer 1 activity lately and how it's like at rock bottom and gas prices are really cheap. You know, that's totally fine. Obviously, it's come down a lot from the bull market, but I don't think it makes sense to just look at layer 1 activity and that's it. You need to start accounting for layer 2 activity because there is actually a lot of layer 2 activity these days on Optimism, on Arbitrum, on these other layer 2 networks out there. You need to look at that activity and pair that with Ethereum layer 1 to get a more accurate view of what's happening on the network. Now, people will say, well, layer 2s aren't really paying much to layer 1 in gas fees. I'm like, yeah, okay, they aren't. And they're probably going to be paying even less once 4844 comes into play. But that's not the point. The point is that the activity is moving, or at least some of the activity is moving from layer 1 to layer 2, so we should be taking it in aggregate. And also, layer 1 gas fees, as soon as the bull market comes back in earnest, guys, layer 1 gas fees are shooting right back up. Like, there's no way they're going to stay at these levels when the market gets hot again. It's just the way it is. Now, you know, long term, will we have gas fees still kind of like high on layer 1? I think we will, as long as we get these breakout applications that we all hope we'll get, especially on these layer 2s. But in the current world, or at least for the next couple of years, as soon as the market gets hot, the gas fees go up. It's pretty much like in correlation with each other. But at the same time, there are people moving from layer 1 to layer 2. So we should look at layer 2 metrics and kind of like pair them with layer 1 instead of just looking at layer 1 there. And to add on to that, there is kind of like a tweet from Orbiter Finance today that basically showed some of this. So you can see here the top 5 rollups with the most new accounts in the last 7 days. You can see Arbitrum Optimism, or Arbitrum 1, Optimism, Arbitrum Nova, Starknet, and ZK Sync, and you can see all the numbers here of that. So this is what I mean. Tracking transactions, tracking new accounts, tracking TVL. I mean, obviously TVL is one of my most hated metrics, but it's still relevant to you know, in some capacity. Tracking fee revenue, tracking smart contracts deployed, right? Tracking interactions with the contracts. All that sorts of stuff should be taken as well as the layer 1 metrics and put together and compared with all of that rather than just taking layer 1. And in that vein of thinking as well, you shouldn't just take layer 2 in as a vacuum either. You should kind of like compare it all together to get the full Ethereum network transactional activity there. All right, last up here, we have a thread from Astaria looking at the Astaria 3-actor model and what that means for the future of NFT lending. So you can go check out this thread. I just wanted to put it on your radar because I know recently there's been a bit of discussion about NFT lending, especially because I think we saw like a liquidation cascade on the Bored Ape Yacht Club. So I kind of recommend reading this this thread here for how Astaria is targeting NFT lending or tackling NFT lending. It's going to be a big thing. I don't think that just because one protocol failed will mean that others fail. I think NFTs obviously are big right now and are going to continue to grow, and people will want liquidity on it. I mean, at the end of the day, NFTs don't have to be just your random profile pictures, NFTs or anything like that. Eventually, NFTs will be people's deed to their houses, and then you could potentially put that up as collateral on something like Astaria and borrow against it, just like you would put it up as collateral in a bank to borrow against it, right? So it's all about not just NFT profile picture stuff that we're seeing today, but anything that is a unique item that you can put up as collateral can be done through platforms like Astaria. But I think on that note, that's going to be it for today. So thank you everyone for listening and watching. Be sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet. Give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the newsletter, join the Discord channel, and I'll catch you all tomorrow. Thanks everyone.